The flight had been uneventful, just like any other. The steady hum of the engines was a comforting sound to those on board. The passengers settled into their seats, chatting quietly, sipping coffee, reading books, all under the soft glow of the overhead lights. But then, without warning, came a scream, high-pitched and filled with panic. It was a mother's desperate cry that cut through the calm of the cabin. She looked terrified, her face pale with fear, and her hands shaking as she cradled her baby. The child's tiny body was trembling uncontrollably and gasping for air. The baby's chest heaved violently, as if it couldn't catch its breath, and the once peaceful atmosphere turned to one of chaos. The mother's voice cracked as she called for help. Every passenger around her turned in alarm, some instinctively reaching for their seatbelts, while others stood up not knowing what to do. The flight attendant rushed to the scene. Her heart raced as she saw the baby's face turning blue. She immediately knelt beside the mother, her mind racing. What could she do to help this baby in the middle of the sky, with no hospital nearby, no doctors, just her basic training, and a small emergency kit that didn't seem enough? She told the mother to stay calm, but the words felt hollow. The mother was panicking more by the second, her baby's life slipping away in front of her eyes. There was no time to waste. The flight attendant quickly opened the kit, her fingers shaking as she grabbed the oxygen mask and placed it over the baby's tiny nose and mouth. But nothing happened. The baby's breathing didn't improve. The mother was pleading now, "Please help, please. Someone help me." Tears began to streak down her face. The desperation in her voice was unbearable. The flight attendant's mind was working in overdrive. She'd been through countless drills and training sessions for moments like this, but nothing had prepared her for this real-life emergency. She needed more help and fast. Her eyes scanned the cabin for someone, anyone who could assist her. She spotted the call button and pressed it urgently, but with every passing second she felt more helpless. Her thoughts raced, and then she saw him, the man sitting a few rows back, staring out the window. Keanu Reeves. He looked so calm in the midst of the growing chaos, but there was something about his demeanor that told her he was no ordinary passenger. It wasn't just the fame or the familiar face that struck her, it was the quiet confidence he carried with him, a certain calmness that seemed to stand out in contrast to the frantic atmosphere around him. He hadn't stood up, yet hadn't moved, but she could see the shift in his eyes as he looked toward the mother and child. There was a recognition there, something in his gaze that said he understood the gravity of the situation. He stood up slowly, as if he had all the time in the world, but the flight attendant could see the urgency in his movements even as he approached. She didn't know why, but she felt an immediate sense of hope. She rushed toward him, as if her own life depended on it. "Please," she whispered to him, almost pleading in desperation. "Please, you have to help." My heart was in my throat. She was barely able to speak with the fear and anxiety flooding her mind. Keanu paused for a moment and simply nodded, but there was something in his eyes, a steady calm that spoke volumes, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He didn't hesitate for a second, stepping toward the baby and the mother, his every move deliberate, as if his entire focus was on the life in front of him. And for the first time since the chaos began, the flight attendant felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. Could he really help? Could this man, who had only moments ago been a stranger to her, somehow be the key to saving this baby's life? The seconds felt like hours as he crouched beside the mother and the baby, his fingers expertly checking for signs of distress, his voice low yet reassuring as he gently spoke to the mother in a calm tone that cut through the panic around them. This was the moment where everything could change. He was the only one who could make a difference now. And in that fragile moment, the cabin felt smaller, the air felt thicker, and all eyes were on Keanu Reeves, the quiet man who had suddenly become the only hope in the sky. The air in the cabin seemed to grow thicker as the minutes passed. Every breath felt heavy, every moment stretched longer than it should have. The flight attendant stood frozen for a split second as Keanu moved closer to the baby. His calm demeanor was a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. The baby's skin was pale, the tiny chest rising and falling erratically with each shallow breath. The mother's hands were trembling as she clutched her child's fragile body, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and desperation. She looked up at Keanu, as if he held the answers to her prayers. She had no idea who he was, But in that moment, he was her only hope. The flight attendant stepped back as Keanu took over. She watched as he knelt beside the baby, his hands steady and gentle. He didn't speak at first, but his presence seemed to calm the frantic energy in the cabin. Somehow, everyone around them was holding their breath. The flight attendant noticed the subtle shift in his posture, his eyes scanning the baby's face, every detail registering. She could see the quiet confidence in his movements, but also something else, an unmistakable intensity. He wasn't just trying to help, he was determined to make a difference. The flight attendant had to fight the urge to ask him what he was doing. How could he possibly know what to do? But she bit her tongue. She had seen enough of these situations to know that when someone stepped up, it didn't matter who they were or where they came from. What mattered was the action they took. Keanu's fingers gently pressed against the baby's tiny chest. As he looked up at the flight attendant, his voice calm and direct, but with a hint of urgency. "We need to get the baby in a better position," he said. The flight attendant nodded and immediately moved to help. She could barely keep her hands from shaking as she adjusted the baby in the mother's arms. Keanu didn't seem rattled at all. He kept his focus on the baby's breathing, watching every rise and fall as though each breath was a countdown ticking away in the back of his mind. He spoke again, softly reassuring the mother, "Don't worry, we're going to get through this. Just keep your baby close to you. Everything will be okay." She nodded, her tears falling freely as she held her baby tightly, her grip tightening, as if her own life was tied to the little one's fragile existence. The flight attendant looked at Keanu in awe. She had never seen someone so calm, so controlled in the midst of such panic. He wasn't just a celebrity. He was a man who seemed to know exactly what he was doing, even without medical training. There was something about him that felt so reassuring. She barely noticed when the captain's voice came through the overhead speakers, announcing that they were preparing for an emergency landing at the nearest airport. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. The time they had was running out. They were still miles above the ground. It felt like the plane was suspended in a moment of terror. They couldn't afford to wait much longer. The baby's breathing hadn't improved. The tightness in the chest was still there, but Keanu's steady presence seemed to make the situation more bearable. The mother looked up at him again, her eyes filled with gratitude and hope, and Keanu smiled just slightly, as if to say he wasn't about to let her down. But inside, Keanu knew the situation was dire. He could feel the weight of each second, as if they were pulling the baby closer to the edge. He checked the baby's breathing again, and then his eyes met the flight attendant's. They exchanged a brief glance, a silent understanding passing between them. She knew they had to act fast. She had seen what could happen when time ran out too quickly, when people panicked and didn't take control. She could see that Keanu had the same understanding, but he didn't let it show. His face was a picture of calm, but underneath that calm was a focused mind working against the clock. The flight attendant could barely hear the voices of the passengers murmuring softly behind them, the whispers spreading like wildfire, as they all realized something was happening, that they were witnessing a life being fought for right here at 30,000 feet in the air. The seconds felt like hours as Keanu moved to the next step. He didn't hurry, but everything he did had a purpose. Everything felt intentional. Every move was a reminder that this was no ordinary situation. He wasn't just a passenger on this flight anymore. He was the only one who could make a difference now. The cabin was eerily quiet now. The hum of the engines felt distant, almost like a muffled sound in the background, as if the world outside had disappeared. The only sounds that remained were the soft gasps of the baby and the rhythmic motion of Keanu's steady hands working over the child's tiny chest. The flight attendant stood nearby, her heart pounding. She had never felt so helpless, and yet so driven to do everything she could to help. She couldn't take her eyes off of Keanu. There was something magnetic about the way he handled the situation. His movements were methodical, his touch gentle but firm. Each second seemed to stretch out longer than the last, yet he remained calm, steady, as if he were in control of everything. But the flight attendant knew better. She could feel the tension in the air. She could see the slight tension in his jaw, the way his eyes narrowed as he monitored the baby's every breath. Keanu wasn't just calm, he was also deeply focused. She glanced over at the mother, still clutching her baby, her face a mix of fear and hope, her hands trembling. But she held on with all the strength she could muster. as if she were willing the baby to survive with sheer willpower alone. She kept glancing up at Keanu, her eyes searching his face for any sign of reassurance, but he gave her nothing other than the quiet confidence of a man who knew that there was still a chance. He was trying everything. Nothing was guaranteed, but he wasn't about to give up. He leaned in closer and checked the baby's airway once more, and then glanced up at the flight attendant, his voice low, but filled with authority. "We need to reposition the baby now, just a little bit more to the left." The flight attendant quickly nodded and moved to help, her hands shaking as she gently shifted the baby in the mother's arms. She could feel the weight of every moment pressing down on her. Every second mattered. Every movement had to be precise. She held her breath as she followed Keanu's instructions, and then watched as he checked the baby. Once more, his fingers still pressed lightly against the tiny chest. But now the baby's breathing had slowed slightly. It wasn't perfect, but it was a sign that they were getting through it. They weren't out of the woods yet, but for the first time in what felt like forever, the flight attendant could see a flicker of hope inside of herself. She had seen this kind of situation before in training, but this was real. This was life or death. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. Keanu's eyes never left the baby's face, even as he spoke to the mother in a soft voice, reassuring her that they were making progress. "Don't worry," he said, "we're getting there. Stay calm. Just keep breathing with your baby. Stay connected." The mother nodded silently, but the flight attendant could see her tears still flowing freely, her eyes wide with fear, but also with a spark of something else, a quiet gratitude. Perhaps it was impossible to know for sure, but the flight attendant could see the way the mother's grip on her baby seemed to relax just a little. The calm in Keanu's voice was doing what nothing else had been able to do. It was breaking through the walls of panic. The cabin was still quiet, but now it wasn't just silence. It was filled with tension. Every single person in that cabin was watching Keanu and the flight attendant. They were watching them fight for the baby's life, and they knew that if they failed, there would be nothing more anyone could do. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, this time more urgent. "We are making an emergency landing in the nearest city. Please remain calm as we prepare to descend." The flight attendant felt a pang of fear. She knew what that meant. They didn't have much time left, and every second counted. If they couldn't stabilize the baby soon, there was no telling what would happen next. But Keanu didn't react to the announcement. He didn't even look up. His focus remained solely on the baby, his every movement deliberate, every breath he took in sync with the baby's, as if he were trying to match the rhythm of life itself. But the pressure was building. She could see it in his face. She could feel it in her own chest. They were running out of time. The flight attendant glanced around the cabin nervously. The passengers were still watching, all of them holding their breath in collective silence. The baby's survival was in their hands. The flight attendant swallowed hard. She had been a part of emergencies before, but nothing like this. This wasn't just a routine drill. This was real, and every second she spent watching Keanu work felt like a gift of life itself. But the question remained, would they make it? Would they save the baby in time? The plane began its descent slowly, the vibrations of the aircraft growing stronger beneath them. The flight attendant could feel the pressure mounting in her chest with every passing moment. Every second seemed to echo louder, as if the very weight of time itself was pressing down on them. The baby's breathing had improved just slightly, but it was still far from enough. The flight attendant couldn't tell if it was the baby's fragile lungs or the situation itself that was draining her strength with every passing moment. Keanu remained calm, his hands still steady as he checked the baby's airway one more time, his eyes focused, his expression unyielding. He seemed unaffected by the growing pressure in the cabin. The quiet whispers of the passengers in the background, the way the temperature seemed to rise just slightly with the increasing tension. It was as if he was in a world of his own, one where the only thing that mattered was the baby's survival. And for a moment, the flight attendant wondered who this man really was. She had heard of him, of course. Everyone had, but she had never seen anyone so calm, so deliberate. In such a high-stakes situation, his focus was complete, as if he were entirely unaffected by the chaos around them. Even though he was part of it, he was the calm in the storm. The flight attendant caught her breath as she watched him move once again, his fingers pressing gently against the baby's tiny chest, his voice soft, but with a certainty that rang through the air. "We need to keep this baby as stable as we can," he said, his words carrying a weight that made her listen intently. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she nodded immediately, following his instructions. No questions. She couldn't afford to question anything now, not when this baby's life hung by such a fragile thread. Keanu looked at the mother, his gaze softening as he spoke to her. "We're going to get through this," he promised. His words were simple, but they carried so much weight. She clutched her baby tighter. The mother's tears had slowed, but her fear was still there. The flight attendant could see it in her eyes. She watched as the mother's hands trembled just a little more with each breath the baby took. It was as if she was trying to hold on to the last bit of hope she had left. She didn't want to believe what was happening was real. The weight of this moment felt too heavy, too cruel to be happening in such a peaceful setting. A flight in the sky should have been a place of safety, yet here they were fighting for the life of a baby thousands of feet above the ground. The flight attendant glanced back at the cabin. The passengers were still watching, some with their eyes closed, others with their hands clasped tightly in prayer. It was as if they all knew how dire this situation was without anyone saying a word. The atmosphere in the plane had shifted. It wasn't just a flight anymore. It was a shared experience, a collective fight for survival. And in that moment, the flight attendant realized that the people around her were just as desperate as she was. They were all part of this fight, even if they weren't physically involved. It wasn't just the flight attendant, Keanu, and the mother. Everyone was in this together. Somehow in their hearts, they all knew the outcome was uncertain, but they hoped that this strange and unexpected moment would end in a miracle. Keanu stood up briefly, his eyes still fixed on the baby. As he glanced toward the cockpit, the flight attendant knew what he was thinking. The plane was descending fast, and they were still miles away from the runway. She couldn't even imagine what the captain was feeling up there in the cockpit, knowing that they were seconds away from landing, and still unable to stabilize the baby enough for the landing to be safe. She didn't want to think about it, but she had to. She had to face the reality that this baby might not make it, not unless they acted quickly. Keanu turned back to the mother, his face still calm, his hand gently brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Don't worry," he said again. "We're almost there. Just stay with me. Stay focused." The mother nodded silently, her eyes glued to Keanu. She believed in him. She trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in her life. And for a fleeting moment, the flight attendant realized that Keanu wasn't just saving a life. He was giving this mother something more. He was giving her hope, a reason to hold on for just a little longer. And that might be the most important thing of all in a situation like this. As the plane continued its descent, Keanu didn't move a muscle. He was in full control of his body, but his mind was working faster than anyone could have imagined. He wasn't just trying to save a baby. He was thinking ahead, making plans. He was focused on what came next, because the descent wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. The plane's descent grew sharper. The flight attendant felt the pressure intensifying in her chest. With every passing second, she glanced at the mother, her face a mix of exhaustion and fear. She held her baby close, her eyes fixed on Keanu, as if he were the only thing tethering her to reality. The baby's breathing had stabilized just slightly, but the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. The flight attendant's heart raced as she moved back and forth between the mother and Keanu. Her hands were trembling, but she had no time to be scared, no time to second-guess. Every decision she made felt like it was a matter of life or death. There was no room for hesitation. Not now, not when they were so close to landing, and the baby's condition was still so fragile. Keanu stood near the mother, watching every breath. The baby took his eyes, never leaving the tiny chest. His every movement controlled his mind, working faster than the flight attendant could follow. He wasn't just reacting to the moment. He was preparing for what came next, preparing for the landing, for what might happen when they hit the ground. He wasn't just a celebrity in this moment. He was the only person in the room who had the calm to think through every possibility and make it through every second without panicking. His focus was unwavering, and the flight attendant couldn't help but feel that same calm start to settle over her. It wasn't just that Keanu knew what to do, it was that his confidence gave her the strength to believe that they could actually pull this off. The tension in the air was palpable as the plane continued to descend. It felt as though time had stopped for a moment, as if the entire world outside the plane had disappeared. They were alone in the sky, and all that mattered was the life of the baby. The flight attendant could hear the distant hum of the engines, but it felt so far away. Everything around her was muffled. All that remained was the mother's silent sobs and the steady breathing of Keanu. As he watched the baby, his eyes narrowed in concentration. He didn't speak much, but his presence alone filled the room. It wasn't just his calm demeanor, it was the way he moved with purpose, the way every action he took felt deliberate, as if he understood that this was more than just a moment in time. It was a life on the line. The baby's breathing was still irregular, but it was better than it had been. It was like a flicker of light in the darkness, a small sign that they were making progress. The flight attendant looked at the captain's seat. She didn't know what was happening in the cockpit, but she could feel the unease there too. The captain was making calculations, adjusting the plane's speed, preparing for the emergency landing. And all the while the seconds felt like they were slipping away. There was a strange stillness in the cabin. Now the other passengers were quiet. Everyone was holding their breath, as if waiting for something to happen. They weren't just passengers anymore. They were witnesses. They were part of this fragile moment of life and death. The flight attendant had never experienced anything like this before. She had worked on planes for years and had seen her share of emergencies, but nothing like this, nothing that had tested her resolve so completely. She glanced at Keanu again, his face still calm, but his brow furrowed slightly as he continued to monitor the baby. He was watching everything: the baby's chest, the air moving in and out, the color of the skin, the subtle shifts in the baby's face. He wasn't missing a single detail, and as she watched him, she realized he wasn't just trying to save the baby. He was in tune with the moment in a way that no one else was. It was as if he could sense the urgency in the air, feel the weight of time ticking away with every breath the baby took, and the flight attendant couldn't help but feel that they were in this together, that this battle wasn't just his or the mother's, it was theirs, all of them working toward one single goal: saving this child. The plane was close now, so close she could feel the tension building again. They had to get the baby stable enough for landing. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, his words a sharp reminder of the urgency. The flight attendant's pulse quickened as she turned her focus back to Keanu. He was still moving with precision, his hands gently pressing on the baby's chest, checking for signs of improvement. His voice was soft as he reassured the mother again. "We're almost there. Just stay calm, stay with your baby, stay close." And the mother nodded again. This time her grip on the baby was firmer, as if she were holding on to that last thread of hope. As the plane continued to descend, the flight attendant held her breath. She could feel her pulse in her ears and the sweat on her palms, but she didn't look away from Keanu. His calmness was their anchor, and somehow in the face of all this chaos it felt like he was the only one who could guide them safely through the storm. The sound of the engines grew louder, the rumble of the aircraft filling the cabin. As the plane descended faster now, the flight attendant's heart raced in sync with the thumping of the aircraft's engines. She glanced at the mother, who was still holding her baby tightly, her hands trembling, but her grip firm. The baby's breathing had become more erratic once again, and the flight attendant's pulse quickened. She could feel the weight of every moment dragging her down, but she couldn't let herself falter. Not now, not when they were so close to landing, and the baby's life was still hanging by a thread. She looked over at Keanu. His face was unreadable, his eyes still locked on the baby. He was focused, every inch of him was in tune with the moment, but even he couldn't hide the slight flicker of worry in his gaze. The tension was building between them. It was palpable, as if they were all part of this one fragile heartbeat. The baby's life wasn't just in their hands, it was in the hands of the clock ticking down to the emergency landing. And the flight attendant knew they were running out of time. She moved quickly to help the mother reposition the baby, her hands shaking as she gently adjusted the tiny body, the weight of the situation pressing down on her. She looked at Keanu again, and his eyes met hers for a brief second. The silent exchange between them said everything they both knew. They were fighting against time, fighting for a life, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. But they didn't let it show. The cabin was silent now, except for the occasional murmurs of passengers who had noticed the severity of the situation. They had all seen what was happening, but no one dared to speak their thoughts. They could feel it in the air, the desperation, the fear that was slowly building, a collective anxiety that held them all in place. Keanu's voice broke the silence again, his words soft but commanding, "We need to prepare for impact," he said without hesitation, his gaze never leaving the baby's face. The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat, but she nodded quickly. She knew exactly what he meant. The plane was descending, and they had to make sure the baby was stable enough to survive the landing. She could feel her chest tighten, but she focused. She had to focus. She quickly glanced out the window as the ground grew closer, the runway visible now. Beneath the aircraft, she could see the flicker of lights from emergency vehicles waiting in the distance, the fire trucks, the ambulances ready to rush in the moment they touched down. But even with that knowledge, it didn't bring her any comfort. There was still so much uncertainty, so much fear that no amount of preparation could erase. Keanu turned his attention back to the mother, his hand gently stroking the top of the baby's head. "Don't let go of your baby. Keep breathing. Stay connected," he said, his voice soothing but firm. The mother nodded, her face pale but determined, her eyes locked on her baby, as if she were willing the life back into the tiny body. The flight attendant could see the anguish on her face, and her heart ached for her. She knew that feeling, that helplessness, that desperation, that nothing in the world mattered more than the life of your child. And she knew this mother was no different. Keanu glanced up at her again, his gaze sharp, as if he had read her thoughts. "We're almost there," he said, "but we need to prepare ourselves for the worst, just in case." The flight attendant nodded again, her hands moving to make the baby as comfortable as possible, while also bracing for the inevitable landing. She felt as if every move she made had to be precise, calculated, as if she were moving in slow motion. But it was the only way she could keep her focus. The seconds seemed to stretch on, and yet the plane was closing in on the runway. Now they were so close, and with each inch closer to the ground, the reality of their situation seemed to sink deeper into her chest. She glanced back at the other passengers. They were still watching silently. Some had their eyes closed, others gripped the armrests tightly. She could feel the weight of their collective gaze. They were all holding their breath, waiting for the moment when the plane would hit the ground, and they would all know if the baby had survived. The descent had been fast and rough, but they were almost there, almost within reach. The flight attendant could feel the sweat on her forehead and her palms, the pressure mounting in every corner of her being. But there was no time for fear, no time for hesitation. All she could do now was hold on to the hope that they had done enough, that Keanu's calm presence had been the lifeline they needed. She glanced at him once more as the plane's wheels touched the ground with a jarring thud, and the flight attendant braced herself for what would come next. The emergency landing had started, but the battle for the baby's life wasn't over. It was just beginning. The plane hit the ground with a deafening thud. The sudden shock of the landing jolted everyone forward. The flight attendant felt her stomach lurch as the aircraft's wheels screeched against the runway. The emergency landing had begun, but the fight was far from over. Her heart pounded in her chest, her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts. But there was only one thing she could focus on now: the baby. Had they done enough? Had they saved the child? The cabin was filled with the sound of the plane's descent, the screeching of metal against asphalt, and the frantic whispers of passengers as they braced themselves for what was to come. The flight attendant glanced at the mother, her eyes wide with fear, but also a flicker of hope as she held her baby tightly in her arms. She wasn't sure if it was the shock of the landing or the realization that they were safe on the ground, but the mother's face had softened ever so slightly. The flight attendant didn't dare take her eyes off Keanu. His steady presence remained even as the plane bounced slightly on the rough landing. The baby's condition was still fragile, but there was a subtle change, a faint sign of life that hadn't been there before. The flight attendant felt a wave of relief wash over her, but it was fleeting. It was too soon to celebrate, too soon to relax. Keanu was already moving again, his eyes scanning the baby, checking for any signs of distress. The flight attendant didn't need to be told. She knew exactly what had to be done. She moved quickly toward the front of the plane and began to prepare the emergency medical supplies the crew had set aside for moments like this. She could hear the captain's voice over the intercom, telling the passengers to stay calm, to remain in their seats as they prepared for the emergency vehicles to board the plane. But none of it registered. She was already lost in the task ahead, her hands moving swiftly as she retrieved the medical kit and checked the oxygen supply. She had trained for this, but it was different now. It felt different. This wasn't just an exercise. This was real life. This was the baby's life. And there was no room for error. Keanu was still working at the mother's side, his face a mask of calm determination. But the flight attendant could see the strain in his eyes. The weight of this moment wasn't lost on him. Either the baby's chest still rose and fell unevenly, but there was a faint rhythm to it now, a steady beat that hadn't been there moments ago. But it wasn't enough. They needed to do more, and they needed to do it fast. The emergency vehicles were approaching. The flight attendant could hear their sirens wailing in the distance, growing closer by the second. But the reality of the situation was still pressing down on her. There was still no guarantee the baby would make it. Not yet. The flight attendant quickly returned to the mother's side, her hands trembling but steady. As she checked the baby once more, she could feel her breath catch as she looked down at the tiny face. The baby's skin was still pale, but there was a subtle pinkish hue that hadn't been there before. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was hope. The flight attendant couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for the work they had done, for the way Keanu had held it together when everything else seemed to be falling apart. But she knew better than to celebrate too soon. The baby was still struggling, still so fragile. Keanu turned his gaze to her, his expression unreadable, but his eyes held something she hadn't seen before, something soft, something vulnerable. It was a fleeting moment, but in that instant the flight attendant realized just how deeply invested Keanu had become in this child's survival. He wasn't just here to help, he wasn't just playing a role, he was as deeply affected by this moment as everyone else. The flight attendant nodded at him silently, and he gave a small nod in return. They didn't need words now, they didn't need to speak. They were both committed to the same goal, saving this baby, no matter what it took. The sound of the emergency vehicles grew louder. Now the plane had come to a full stop, and the doors opened quickly. But the flight attendant didn't look back. She was still focused on the baby, and Keanu was still by her side, his presence unwavering. As always, they were ready, they were as prepared as they could be, but they both knew that it was up to the medical team now to take over. It was out of their hands. But the flight attendant didn't know if she would ever be able to forget the weight of those minutes when everything had been uncertain, when they had fought for this child's life with nothing but sheer will and hope. When the plane had touched down, they hadn't just landed, they had crossed a threshold together, and for the first time in hours, the flight attendant allowed herself a breath. She didn't know if the baby would make it, but she knew one thing for sure: they had done everything they could. The emergency vehicles were now surrounding the plane, their sirens wailing loudly as they skidded to a stop. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, staring at the door where the medical team was rushing inside. The tension in the air was thick as the seconds seemed to stretch on. The baby's tiny chest was still rising and falling, though much slower than before. The flight attendant's heart hammered in her chest, her body still on high alert. She glanced at Keanu, his eyes still fixed on the baby, his face pale but resolute. He had given everything he had in those moments, everything. He had to make sure this baby had a chance. And as the medical team burst through the doors, the flight attendant knew that it wasn't over yet. It would never be over, not for her, not for Keanu, not for the mother. But for now, the baby was safe in the hands of the professionals who had the skills to help. She stepped back, allowing the paramedics to take control. Their movements fast and efficient. They immediately began checking the baby's vital signs, their hands working quickly as they placed the child on the stretcher and attached oxygen masks. The flight attendant couldn't look away, her chest still tight as she watched the scene unfold. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding her breath until she felt her lungs finally fill with air, her shoulders dropping in exhaustion. The job wasn't done, but they had done everything they could. And that was something. The paramedics worked with precision, each of them talking to each other in hushed tones, confirming what they had found and making immediate decisions. The flight attendant stood aside, her hands still trembling, but she held herself together. She was so close to breaking, but she wouldn't, not yet, not until she knew for sure that the baby was going to be okay. Keanu was still standing there by the mother, his face serious as he watched the medical team, his mind working in the same way it had throughout this entire ordeal. Every small movement, every word exchanged between the paramedics seemed to be processed with a calm he had shown since the moment he stepped onto the plane. He was the rock in the storm, and the flight attendant couldn't help but admire him for it. The medical team moved quickly. They attached an IV to the baby's tiny arm and administered fluids. The flight attendant felt a wave of relief. As the baby's breathing steadied just a little bit more, the paramedics were speaking now, giving instructions to the crew as they prepared to transfer the baby to an awaiting ambulance that would take them to the hospital for further care. The flight attendant's hands slowly fell to her sides. She didn't know whether to collapse or to keep standing, to keep watching. But she stayed in place, waiting, watching, praying silently that the baby would pull through. She turned to the mother, who was still standing by her baby's side, her face filled with tears. But now there was something else in her eyes, something the flight attendant had hoped for since the moment they had started this journey, a glimmer of hope. The mother's lips trembled as she whispered a soft thank you to the crew, thank you to Keanu, thank you to the flight attendant. And though the words were small, they were everything. It was the confirmation that they had done something meaningful, that they had saved a life. Keanu's eyes flicked to the mother, and for the first time since the chaos began, his face softened, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He didn't need to say anything, because everything that needed to be said had already been understood. He had been a lifeline to them all. And even though they weren't out of the woods yet, the baby had a chance. The ambulance doors slammed shut, and the teen rushed toward the waiting vehicle. A flight attendant watched them go, her heart still racing in her chest. But the fear that had held her so tightly for the last few hours began to loosen just a little. She turned to Keanu, and for a moment their eyes met, a shared understanding passing between them. They had done everything they could. They had fought for that baby's life, and in the end that was all they could ask for now. It was in the hands of the doctors. But for now, for this moment, they could all breathe again. The flight attendant let out a shaky breath as she looked around the cabin. The passengers were still quiet, some of them staring in disbelief at the scene that had unfolded before them. But the silence wasn't suffocating anymore. It was different. It was a quiet moment of collective relief and gratitude. Keanu turned away from the door and nodded once more at the flight attendant. And though he didn't say a word, she knew that he too was feeling the weight of this moment lift from his shoulders. For now they had done the impossible together, and for once in this chaotic world, they had shared something unspoken. They had saved a life.